The night at Windsor Castle began like any other royal occasion. Polished silver gleaming under the chandelier's glow, glasses raised in rehearsed toasts, and smiles that looked flawless but felt hollow. Yet beneath the grandeur, tension simmered like an unspoken storm. Every glance across the table carried weight, every silence hinted at rivalries too deep for the cameras to ever capture. And at the heart of it sat Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales, her serene composure masking the quiet strain of years spent navigating the palace's hidden battles. No one knew it yet, but this evening would shatter that mask, setting off a chain of events that would leave the monarchy reeling, and force Prince William to break a silence he had kept his entire life. Inside the palace the air thickened into something almost tactile, the kind of pressure that makes every breath feel rationed. Advisors moved like shadows across polished floors, whispering in corridors where portraits of unblinking ancestors watched with eternal judgment. They told the Prince of Wales that what he was planning would scorch the varnish from the institution, that candor was an acid that once poured could not be gathered back into the bottle. They reminded him of precedent and protocol, of the monarchy's survival through curated restraint, of the invisible scaffolding of mystique that held the whole edifice in place. He listened, gave them the stillness of his face and the slowness of his breath, and let them believe they were persuading him. But the decision had already hardened inside him like a new spine. The truth would be spoken aloud, and the risk was secondary to the obligation he felt to the woman lying pale and recovering behind guarded doors. At dawn Kensington Palace was transformed into a theater. Black vans, bright lights, telescoping microphones, bodies wrapped in dark coats against the cold morning air, every corner was claimed by lenses and speculation. The courtyard carried a strange reverence, as if the press could sense what was about to happen did not fit inside the usual script. Producers rehearsed fragments of analysis. Commentators parked metaphors and predictions like cars in a tight, crowded lot. The world's attention squeezed itself through a handful of iron gates and waited. When he stepped out, the atmosphere changed with such clarity that even those watching through screens could feel the hinge moment. He moved with the deliberation of someone who had measured, on a personal scale, the weight of history and found it finally unbearable. Everything about him, shoulders, jaw, the long exhale before he reached for the podium, signaled a new tone, a break from inherited language. He did not appear as a man defending reputation. He appeared as a man defending a person he refused to lose to the same invisible machinery that had once consumed his mother. What followed did not sound like a royal statement. It sounded like testimony. He spoke of cycles the monarchy never admitted but always repeated, of wounds that bloom beneath silence, of the way institutions mistake the absence of noise for the presence of dignity. He described cruelty without theatrics, the kind that operates in whispers, behind doors, in looks exchanged across polished tables. He did not need to name the aggressor. Direction was enough. He held up the mirror to the palace and forced its reflection to linger. He referenced the past without exploiting it, yet every ear heard the echo. The refusal was absolute. This story would not be allowed to replay, not with the same characters, not with the same ending. Buckingham Palace felt the shock before the last syllable carried across the courtyard. In one suite, a teacup splintered in an instant, porcelain spreading across carpet like frost fractals. Down the hall, a king absorbed the blow quietly, understanding with the precision of regret that the words he had just heard were not a rebellion but a reckoning. He had lived under the weight of what silence had cost, and though loyalty tied him to the institution, fatherhood tethered him to the speaker. He recognized the pain as legitimate, the fury as earned, the defiance as necessary. By nightfall the speech had escaped containment. It looped in every time zone, translated into languages that did not have a word for monarchy in the British sense but had more than enough for betrayal and protection. Social feeds erupted into avalanches of allegiance. Hashtags solidified into digital banners. The public made their choice, fast and emotionally, as they do when something feels both familiar and intolerable. Flowers congregated at Kensington's gates, handwritten notes pinned to ribbons, photos of Diana placed side by side with Kate as though genealogy could be rewritten through collective will. The monarchy lost the luxury of silence. narrative control had transferred to the people, who told their own story of what a future queen should look like and declared her already standing in front of them. Inside the palace apparatus, the response devolved into a flurry of drafts and deletions. Teams debated adjectives like battle commanders argue terrain. Every sentence felt like stepping onto thin ice. The instinct was to deny, to smooth, to file off the edges. An instinct that, for once, everyone recognized would inflame rather than contain. A different kind of war room formed, one that assessed not press angles but ethical temperature. Old strategies, delay, obfuscate, brief selectively, looked outdated beneath the glare of a population that had learned to read between lines long ago. In hushed meetings, there was a dawning consensus. The institution would not survive another burial. It would have to bleed visibly if it wanted to heal. The Princess of Wales returned to the public eye with an economy of gesture that was as strategic as it was sincere. She rejected spectacle in favor of something gentler. A children's hospital visit was chosen not because it would image well, but because it framed her not as a victim seeking vindication, but as a servant continuing to serve. Cameras caught what couldn't be scripted, the softening of her posture at a bedside, hands forming a cradle around a tiny wrist, the way her face, though still drawn at the edges, radiated a warmth that could not be coached. Commentators, starved for clean narratives, wrote hers with reverence. The phrase "people's queen in waiting" surfaced, at first in tabloids and timelines, then in broadsheets and boardrooms. It stuck. Her husband watched her move through crowds and rooms with an attention the lenses could not fully capture. He had made his choice. She had answered with resilience rather than retreat. Together, whether they had intended to or not, they had forced the monarchy into a new posture. One where humanity was no longer the enemy of the crown but its sole remaining defense. The queen consort receded, not by formal announcement but by absence. Engagements were postponed with unconvincing phrasing about scheduling conflicts and private matters. In the corridors, once loyal aides realigned themselves using the palace's usual calculus of survival. Influence flowed where public trust settled, and public trust now sat with the couple who had weathered the storm by walking directly into its eye. Within private circles, fury simmered, the kind that looks for a lever, any lever, to regain balance. Yet every attempt to reassert control found itself blunted against the wall of a nation that had already decided where its sympathy lay. Rehabilitation would be slow, and it would not be allowed to happen in the shadows. When the king finally spoke, his words were brief, chosen like stones placed carefully to hold a riverbank. He invoked family as the primary architecture of the monarchy, acknowledged, in a monarch's measured way, that the past still bleed into the present, and offered both support and affection to the woman his son had defended. It read as acknowledgement, not apologia. Those looking for a fracture did not find one. Those looking for a signal saw it clearly. Unity in public, however fragile in private, was the new rule. Yet behind oak doors and below chandeliers, there were recalibrations. Protocols tightened. Access lists shrank. And still, someone always knew someone, and news still fluttered through corridors like trapped birds. The sense of invulnerability had been pierced. Even those who despised the new transparency recognized its protective power. Secrets, if not abolished, would be judged by their potential to destroy the trust that had just been so precariously won back. The press, emboldened by the sudden visibility inside the palace, turned its attention to the institution's deeper seams. Mystique, once a shield, became a target. Analysts ran timelines that mapped patterns of isolation, favoritism, and quiet character assassination against the health of royal marriages and the prevalence of mental strain. Editorials asked whether a monarchy could survive without secrecy, and if secrecy itself had rendered it unsustainable. The palace, normally adept at drowning noise in ceremony, discovered that ceremony itself now looked like narrative avoidance. The machine that relied on mystery was being forced to write a user manual in real time. For Kate, the weeks that followed became a test of balance. She needed to be seen enough to maintain the faith that had rallied around her, but not so much as to look like she was capitalizing on her own suffering. She had to embody composure without suppressing humanity. The country read every gesture as signal. She learned to treat each one as a message. She wore simplicity with intentionality, moved with restrained energy, and let the cameras catch fatigue when it came, because fatigue made sense and pretense would have been unforgivable. William discovered that truth-telling, however cathartic, is not a resting place but a posture that must be maintained. He became a different kind of heir, less custodian of mystique than guardian of legitimacy. He protected the crown by protecting the person at its center, and that inversion did not go unnoticed. Younger staffers saw a blueprint for a modern monarchy: transparency where possible, firm boundaries where necessary, and a refusal to perform stoicism at the expense of well-being. Older courtiers feared the loss of the old armor, but even they could not deny the public's appetite for a monarchy that bled when it was hurt and admitted it when it healed. In long private nights, the couple sat with the knowledge that they had changed the rules and could not rely on them giving the same cover they once did. Their children slept above rooms where strategies were drafted. Their own rest came fitfully, punctuated by memories that never fully dulled. Marble floors, the sharp intake of breath, the sudden vacuum where a heartbeat should have been steady. They spoke, in the new language of no longer innocence, about the lines they would draw, the exits they would use if required, the legacy they would accept and the legacies they would dismantle. Their intimacy became a strategic asset as well as a sanctuary, and while that truth was both sobering and sad, it also steeled them. This was the life they had, and they would make it survivable. The queen consort, out of sight but not out of calculation, considered her own path back to equilibrium. She understood public opinion, having been forged against its fire once before. She knew contrition would read as manipulation, and defiance would read as guilt. The only workable route was patience, the slow grind of time that shifts focus elsewhere. Yet time now moved differently. The digital age archived every misstep and returned it with a single search. Survival would require a new fluency: trust management, transparency theater, the careful release of controlled vulnerability. Power had migrated from titles to perception, and perception belonged to the crowd. The king's health, the constant low drumbeat beneath the public drama, forced urgency into every decision. Succession was no longer a hypothetical but a visible, looming eventuality. The country, watching their future monarch and his consort demonstrate a model of leadership that emphasized empathy over aloofness, seemed willing to accept the crown in new hands, provided those hands remained open. The institution, which had survived wars, abdications, divorces, and scandals, now faced a subtler threat: the demand to justify its existence not through tradition alone, but through moral coherence. As spring eased into the city, Kate and William stepped onto balconies, through hospital doors, into community centers, schools, and small corners of Britain often overlooked by ceremonial routes. They did so not in triumph but in continuation. Every appearance said the same thing in a language of presence: we are still here, we are still working, we will not be driven inside. The cameras followed, respectful now in a way they had not always been, because spectacle had become less interesting than survival. The story was no longer about scandal but about how an ancient structure might allow itself to be human and still endure. Behind them, the palace continued to rearrange itself into something that could absorb this new reality. Training manuals were updated. Media protocols quietly rewritten. Wellness provisions were strengthened. Private rooms became safer, not merely prettier. The idea that pain should be hidden as a form of duty began to look like cruelty packaged as tradition. Some of the old guard bristled. Some resigned. New voices rose, not loud, but steady. They argued that the crown's sheen would return only if it reflected something recognizably real. And so the story that began with a collapse on stone and a decision to speak instead of swallow became the hinge upon which the monarchy pivoted. It did not turn into a fable with clean heroes and villains, because real power rarely permits simplicity. It settled instead into a complex equilibrium: a princess who carried the faith of a nation like a quiet weight, a prince who chose love over secrecy and discovered that doing so saved the institution more than it hurt it, a king who acknowledged that the past could not be repeated without losing everything, and a queen consort who learned that influence in the modern age cannot be commanded without consent. In the end, the palace lights dimmed on a structure still standing, though visibly altered, its edges softened by exposure, its foundation strengthened by a reluctant honesty. The cameras moved on, as they always do, hungry for fresh terrain. The flowers wilted, were gathered up, composted into soil that would feed other blooms. The hashtags faded under the churn of new storms. Yet something remained, an imprint pressed into the memory of the crowd, a prince at a podium tearing the seal off royal silence, a princess beside him unwavering, and an institution forced to admit what everyone else already knew. That truth, openly told, may wound, but it is the only thing that allows trust to grow back in the spaces secrecy has hollowed out. The story did not resolve itself into peace so much as into vigilance. Every time the palace felt the urge to bury, to smooth, to smother discord under velvet, another memory rose. A marble floor, a sudden fall, a decision to speak. Not again, the public said without saying it. Not her. Not this time. And because that collective vow was louder than ceremony, it became the crown's newest and most binding contract. In that way, the collapse became a cornerstone. The truth, once spoken aloud, settled under the weight of the monarchy like a foundation stone, cold, hard, unmovable, and finally strong enough to hold. Like and subscribe the channel for more updates from the British royal family.